Doug, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, or from where I am in the United States, good morning. And it obviously goes without saying that since I didn't come here on a boat, I flew on an aircraft that came out of Edinburgh International Airport, through Dublin, changed, and then got here. But all of us are affected by the world of travel, and all of us are affected by the airline industry. And so we are very, very fortunate to have Gordon Dewar to talk with us today. Gordon must in some ways have got the job from hell, given what's going on with COVID-19 at the moment. And he took over his post as Chief Executive of Edinburgh Airport in July of 2012, and he's been rebranding it and making it carry the tagline of where Scotland meets the world. And Gordon, I wondered if we could ask you to start off by just reflecting on how things have been for you in the past few months and what the outlook is.
Yeah, thanks, Roddy, and good afternoon to everyone. And thanks for finding the time to join. I said before you were all let into the meeting, I said I hope nobody's coming here for any optimism, because I'm a bit short of that at the moment, certainly in the short term. So I think it's been a pretty traumatic year, as you can imagine. I think we got earlier sight than most of how bad this was going to be, although I don't think any of us thought it'd be quite as bad as this. And when I say earlier, it was amazing how, you know, even a couple of weeks of advance notice transformed the sort of understanding we had, and very quickly demonstrated how difficult it was to get your head around just what was going to happen next. I was on a call, I think in early March, maybe late February, with the Edinburgh Festivals Forum, which I'm a member of, and they were all still debating about, you know, whether they should be planning for a 50% decline or a 60% decline in the festival, but still intending to run it. And I kind of kept my counsel to the end of the call and gave them a fairly confident proposal that if they were still able to operate in 2021, they'll have had a good outcome. But even, you know, I'd love to say I was predicting hugely different to anybody else, but it was literally a couple of weeks earlier and still not pessimistic enough about what was about to come. So the year's been pretty shocking again. We even, right up until March the 23rd lockdown, that's a birthday I'll not forget, honey. We were still hoping to have 20 or 30% of normal demand. And of course, very, very quickly, it went to virtually zero, less than 1% of typical demand. And that lasted a very large number of weeks. Even then, we were forecasting, hopefully, there was somewhere between 3 and 6 months of lockdown, and then coming back to a fairly strong recovery from some point where we were kind of out of the woods. And that was based on pretty good evidence from things like, you know, other pandemics or breakouts of disease-based things. It was based on some of the work looking at after the global financial crisis. And yet what we're seeing is we're along the bottom. We're up to about 20% of demand now, although that's going backwards again. I'll come back to that. So, you know, the bottom of this is much, much longer and much more severe than anybody's ever seen before. And the recovery plan in terms of when it might start is uncertain. And given how long it's lasted, just how much scarring there is and what pace of recovery and how long to get back to anything like 2019 levels is really a huge unknown at the moment. So that's been pretty miserable. We went through the obvious cash preservation. We're losing money at about £3 million a month, and that continues at the moment. So everything was about liquidity and protecting the ability to survive. We were pretty quick out the blocks on that. We've got very good shareholders who kind of understood all of the kind of needs to get liquidity in place and were able to help us. And so we got into about 75 million of additional liquidity funding from our existing lenders, and we've now accessed the Bank of England COVID fund as well. So I'm very, very confident we can survive this, but of course it's not painless when even when we're out the other side, we're going to have significantly more debt than we had before to service as well. But probably the most painful one was that realisation of how long lasting this was going to be, and the prospects that even 21 will be significantly lower than 2019 levels. I'm not going to talk about forecasts, we just deal with the ranges of scenarios at the moment. It's that difficult. We took a view as to what we should plan for in terms of being capable of starting again next spring. And we then went through a very difficult consultation process with all the staff, and we've unfortunately had to conclude that we need to lose about a third of our staff, and they'll all leave at the end of October when the furlough scheme wraps up. So that was certainly the darkest day of my career, was the announcement about who's going and the scale of that announcement. Of course, not nearly as dark for me as those that got the bad news that they were no longer part of the team through zero fault of their own. particularly when we've been such a successful business over the last 6 or 7 years, and they've all contributed hugely to that. So it's a really depressing situation. I look at the forward thinking, and it's all about, well, what's going to be different. And I'll stop talking just now because you asked me a backward-looking question. That's kind of probably gets me up to speed. But we do have the challenge of what's going to be different if we're not going to be facing, unpredictable demand, very, very low demand next year, and all of the implications, not just for aviation, but for everyone else that relies upon it.
Gordon, thanks. Given your long involvement with the transportation industry, I'm sure you're very much in touch with those running other airports, both domestically and internationally. Are other airports facing similar challenges, or would you say that some of the regions have more acute problems to deal with?
I think everyone's facing the same challenge. I mean, when travel demand is this low, it really doesn't matter where you start from, you're in trouble if it's going to be sustainable. I think we're stronger than most. We've got a very strong economy around Edinburgh and East Scotland, and we've demonstrated that by growth. So the same fundamentals will be helpful in us recovering. We're a far stronger financial position than many airports, although of course across Europe and the rest of the world, the vast majority of airports are actually government owned, so that's a sort of slightly different scenario. But my honest expectation is that we will see a very, very significant reduction in the number of airports and the number of airlines across Europe and the rest of the world in the next couple of years. And that's inevitable. And depending on government interventions, that will be those with the biggest challenges failing first and leaving the stronger businesses, which I would argue Edinburgh is one of, to pick up the pieces. And in a sense, that's my only optimism for recovery, is that we might be having less competition and being able to take up a larger market share. But that's entirely dependent on airlines, where EasyJet is as an example, while I've got every confidence EasyJet will weather the storm and actually do relatively well when we're back to normal, because they've lost so many competitors. They've already made the decision to cut their fleet by 20%. So there's going to be a lot less capacity flying around in Europe for sure, and the rest of the world, as I'm certain. And therefore, pace of recovery is as important as the strength of the recovery, because if you wait too long or the conditions don't allow, there will be nothing left to recover, because all of the much smaller number of assets will have been bagged by other airports.
To what extent is the freight business affected? Because of course freight doesn't carry COVID-19 in theory. Has that held up at all, or has that gone through the floor as well?
It's actually, so the dedicated freight and cargo business has actually done quite well. There's, all those that are dealing with a parcel type service did really well, along with Amazon out of this. So there's a fair bit of that going on. We're not particularly focused on freight, and the freight we do is either the sort of DHLs of the world that I've just talked about, or we've got some fairly modest capacity and belly cargo, which is the Qatars and the Emirates of the world. Yeah. That's a relatively low percentage. And the trouble is the freight will rarely keep it worthwhile flying on its own. So Emirates still hasn't restarted. Qatar keeps flying, and I'm sure the freight's an important aspect of their reason to keep doing so. But it's not going to get us back to anywhere near. But the dedicated freight guys are doing okay, I think.
Thank you. Well, we're very fortunate having on this call with us Jenna Donaldson from Qatar Airways. And Jenna, I wonder if you'd like to ask some questions.
Yes. Oh, thank you very much, first of all, Gordon, for your insight today. It's extremely important and very informative. And thank you very much, Asia Scotland Institute, for your continued support. Do you feel Edinburgh Airport should have received and be receiving more support from the government or even Border Force to encourage more travel to and from Edinburgh?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the support's come in a number of ways. I think you can't really fault some of the early government interventions, things like the furlough scheme, things like the loan scheme, both of which we've taken advantage of. And in Scotland, Scotland's been much more generous with business and rate holidays, for example, which we've been a beneficiary of, and our English airport colleagues have not. We've also had our police charges. So airports are quite unique. They pay additionally for their police services on top of what they pay through business rates. And again, that's been waived this year, and there's a good agreement going forward. So there's an in principle wish to help, but I'm not sure it really understands the scale of the challenge that's coming at us specifically for our industry. And the side of it that makes it really difficult is that at the moment, the only solution that government, or the UK and Scottish government, appear to have to COVID is quarantine or travel bans in any other name. because we know that as soon as you stick a quarantine on, the demand crashes to about 10% of what its normal levels would be. And Jenna, as you know, very few airlines can fly around with 10% of the seats filled and expect to make any money out of that. In fact, none can. So what happens is the service falls away, the passengers are not flying. So it's a travel ban. Now, I've got no doubt that if you don't let anybody travel, then you're not importing COVID. That's obvious. What's less certain is that that's doing you any good in the long run, particularly when we ban some countries and have no testing or controls at all on others. So our challenge to government is start thinking in the long term, presume that some level of COVID protection, whether it's the echoes of this or the threat of future pandemics, is going to be there, and have a better solution, because just crashing demand and closing borders is not particularly effective and will have enormous consequences for economic damage.
Do you think bringing in the PCR testing into Edinburgh Airport would actually help that?
Yeah, I mean, I just came off a call today, and we're not trying to embarrass government. We're trying to give them choices that are going to be really difficult. So at the moment, they've not really explored the capability of testing and what it might do in a risk-based analysis of, compare it to quarantine and air bridges and have that. It's likely, I suspect, that it won't be quite as safe, because if somebody's travelling, that must add some new risk that if nobody was travelling, that's true. But it should be a balanced discussion against the other impacts of this, the job losses, the long-term damage on tax take, which funds our health service and so on. And that's what's been missing, is the ability to have what I would call a sort of nuanced and balanced conversation. At the moment, if the medics just hint that one extra person is going to get COVID, nothing happens. And that's not the way society really behaves. We only let drugs onto the National Health Service if they save a life at less than £330,000 per life. Yet we're apparently spending £150 million per life, based on the government's own statistics of what we've saved with COVID. So that doesn't seem to me to be very sensible. That being said, I wouldn't want to be the politician that stands up and says, I'm prepared to risk your granny for the sake of a few jobs, even if it's thousands of jobs. Yeah. And that's the problem that politicians have when they are taking such direct control of policy and are being presented with cases in real time by the hour, when they're just not got the space or the understanding to look at the long-term economic consequences.
Do you think they should have the space and the time to do so? Do you think it's quite important?
I think we should, and I think there's got to be a degree of delegation here. So I liken this to the 9/11 challenge for aviation, and maybe other industries have their model. But we were faced with a completely out of the blue challenge when the Twin Towers came down, and a need for facing into a completely new kind of threat. And that was closely followed by the liquids problem, if you remember, the shoe bomber. And yet the response to that from government was the government didn't try and do everything. What the governments of the world did was got together and agreed a set of standards that would allow aviation to start again. Now, it was hugely costly, massively difficult to achieve, and we all remember the queues. But the industry got on and did that within 3 to 6 months, and fundamentally changed the entire aviation market within 6 months at its own cost. Been able to deploy all of the resources we have, and most importantly, having the motivation to do so, because if we didn't have a business. So my fear is that if government sequentially going around sector by sector trying to fix it for us, we'll be here a long time.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with that. And then I think you also agree with me, I'd love to see the air passenger duty tax abolished, the APD. But my suggestion is to try and encourage the government to initially maybe move on it, is actually abolish the APD for fuel efficient aircraft, carbon efficient fuel efficient aircraft flying into Edinburgh and Scotland. And would you support that for an initiative just to get the government moving forward, and also showing their support in carbon efficiency and sustainability?
Yeah, I think that's a really good challenge, and for two reasons. One is we need to create the conditions for the strong to trade themselves out again, rather than prop up the failures, because I think that will be bad money, putting good money after bad. Somebody can ask me at Prestwick Airport in a minute, and that's always good for a giggle. But we should be doing things like dropping APD, looking after business rates, incentivising us rehiring staff again, not just bailing out the first businesses that fall over. And of course, APD is a huge part of that in their industry, but I'd say that's a theme for all sectors, is that give them a chance to trade out of this, particularly when they've had to pick up new debt to survive it in the first place. It's on the specifics of aviation, and I would widen it probably to tourism in general, is I do think there should be a new contract for government support that says if they do give us APD holidays or other forms of economic support, we must respond. And that is about new fleets and more fuel efficient aircraft, and of course Qatar Airways are in the lead in that in the world. But it's also about how we as a country, how tourism operators, about how we work with airports, and how we get to the airport. All of these things are part of that equation. And government giving us that incentive to say, you get slightly better treatment if you are being responsible and have a plan for the future. I would take that further and say I think Scotland should have the ambition of being the most sustainable tourism destination in the world as a competitive advantage, far less waiting for somebody to force us on it, because this was going to happen anyway. So why don't we just grasp that bull by the horns and get on and deliver something? And Scotland is genuinely uniquely placed with all of our wild countryside and our sea and our ability to generate renewables. I genuinely think we could be world leading in this, but we've got to be thinking 2, 3, 4 years ahead at the moment. My concern is we're not even thinking 2 weeks ahead.
Maybe slightly sideways, on the charter side, we've definitely found through the pandemic we have a growing demand for charters alongside scheduled, because a lot of routes have stopped. So we're needing charters now to bring into scheduled. So it's been a great collaboration. So I'm just wondering, on your insight on the charter side, coming in and to and from Edinburgh Airport, safety and hygiene is a huge part. What does Edinburgh Airport have in place for private, whether executive or large aircraft coming into Edinburgh Airport? What do you have in place for safety standards?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of chatter around repatriation, sort of like the early and mid part of the lockdown, and that seems to have been sort of a bit less now. But it's going to be interesting, isn't it, if we're going to see a lot, people see it as COVID secure to have, a constrained passenger set on it, even if it's got a large number of people. I think if it's airlines like your own doing charters, I think we could do a lot of bespoke stuff in terms of offering service to check-in and segregating and all the rest of it. Although I think a lot of the work we've done on making the airport COVID secure already is relevant for everyone that's using it. On the smaller scale, we were already thinking about putting a new general aviation terminal in place, because we saw that as being quite an attractive proposition just as a part of our regular business. And there's no doubt there's been a real uptick in interest in general aviation, where people were either incapable of getting somewhere or wanted that additional security of being able to take the family and the friends on much smaller groups and in a more controlled way. So I think we've got to respond and offer all of that. But my business is a mass business, as yours is, and there might be some peripheral or some marginal business that's worth having and would support it. But until we can get back to mass transit in its truest sense, that's not really going to hold water for the long term.
And Gordon, is Hainan Airlines still flying, the Chinese airline, or is that stopped for the moment?
It's not flying with us at the moment. So basically, the Chinese have banned that. There's no international flights out of Beijing Airport. It's kind of bubbled the whole capital city. And in any event, there's been various restrictions imposed, some of which might be to do with COVID, but I would argue as much of it's to do with some of the marketplace issues and Huawei and all the rest of it. So we're trying to show willing and encourage Hainan and the Chinese authorities to say they will be welcome at the right time, because that's proving a little sticky. I can't get the British ambassador to write a letter of support to Hainan just saying that when we're ready, we'd like to see you back. And some of the reasons for that are a bit opaque to me, to be honest. So again, I think it's a lack of foresight. I think we need to be thinking, what do we want this place to look like 2 years from now, post Brexit, post COVID? And I just don't see anybody thinking in that time frame.
And one of your very important clients, if I can put it that way, is the university sector, which of course longs to get, when it's safe, students from Asia to come to study. And we heard that from Peter Matheson, the Vice Chancellor of Edinburgh University in one of our earlier webinars, and also from India. So that's of major economic concern in Scotland as well.
Yeah, huge. And of course, it's these students that are cross-subsidising Scottish students not having to pay fees. So yeah, it's massive, the impact for the domestic market as well as the wider economic balance of trade. So, we know that's important. We've tried to help the universities where they were looking for charters to get Chinese and other students in. and all we can do, of course, is really just do introductions to airlines and so on. And I'm not actually sure how far that's got, largely because there are so many restrictions about general passengers, never mind students. So it's all very frustrating. We've just got to find an alternative to this blanket banning, or it does annoy me calling it quarantine, because just nobody flies, and then the 10% that do fly, nobody checks whether they're quarantined. So it's a bit of a misnomer.
Yeah. Thanks, Jenna. We'll come back to you if you have any more questions, but I think I'll just pass over to Doug now to let in some others who've got questions for Gordon. Doug?
Yes, Gordon, I know you said that you weren't going to forecast anything, but clearly, if COVID continues in the way that we perhaps imagine, what's your thoughts about the sort of structural change that might happen to aviation sector in both airlines and airports across the UK? Do you have a view on that?
Well, we have to find an alternative to quarantine, or there won't be an industry. So you either gamble on a vaccine or something changing in the disease itself, or the way we treat people to catch it, that allows us to be less concerned about its impact, or we do direct mitigations, which I believe the most promising is testing, ideally departure testing. So before you even come in the airport, we know you're clean. But in the short term, before you get international collaboration, probably needs to be arrival testing, because you're trying to protect your own population. It's imperfect, but it's better than the alternatives, or something else. But I don't see what that something else is. So if we continue with putting up quarantine at the first sign of a problem, then we won't have an industry in the direction that we understand it. So it is that existentialist in terms of its scale of challenge. No business. We are by far and away the strongest airports in Scotland. We're losing £3 million a month. And Glasgow's carrying similar amounts of debt and has had half of the recovery we had. And I don't say that with any pleasure, because it just demonstrates how difficult the market is and what we need to be very substantially different for any of us to survive this. I mean, the one thing I would say is we've got enough cash to get through till probably early 22, even with zero revenue. So this is not a short-term survival issue for us. But this is absolutely crucial for the idea that the Scottish tourism sector can survive, 2 summer seasons without any meaningful demand is just laughable, frankly. We look at who spends money. The Chinese spend double what the Americans spend. The Americans spend 4 times what the Europeans spend, and the Europeans spend twice what the Brits spend. And all we've got left are the Brits at the moment. Yeah. And actually what we've got left are the Glaswegians who are normally in Benidorm.
We've got a question from Sunil. Sunil, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
My question is somewhat broad. First of all, I want to congratulate Gordon on being associated with an industry which is the safest mode of transport that we have currently. So congratulations, you and Jenna and Gordon, for that. But my question is a little bit broader. What is your view, Jenna and Gordon, actually, both of you, that there is no aviation, there's no tax on aviation fuel? That does not reflect the true cost of flying. Because just to give an example, I've been flying for at least 45 years now, and more frequently for the last 35, 40 years, and particularly between Bombay and Heathrow. And the fare has almost always remained £500 for the last 35 to 40 years. Now that can't be right. And of course, there was no aviation fuel taxes then, and there are no aviation fuel taxes now. What's the airline industry's view on this? Because you must, as an environmentalist, I think that you must tell the users the true cost of flying. Thank you.
So I agree with you. We should face up to the true cost, and that, of course, includes the cost of carbon and the impact on the environment on that. It's not true that we don't have fuel taxation, largely because it would be very, very uncompetitive unless the whole world decides to do something similar. We are by very nature an international business, and therefore doing anything less than sub-European as a minimum would be incredibly damaging, and even then you'd have to fix the border and the boundary impacts of outside of Europe. But we do. It's not true to say we're not taxed. In fact, APD is £13 a passenger within Europe, and it's £78, I think, minimum for flying long haul, and double that if you're flying long haul business class. So the taxation has been taken, the value's there. And put that in context again, I know the cost of carbon in the carbon market of the world is probably far too low in terms of its impact at the moment. But all you can do is look at the carbon markets, and the cost on carbon, if you went and offset it or paid someone else to capture it on flying to Geneva, is £2.50 return. The cost of carbon flying to India would be about £30. So you are paying it, you're just not paying it in something that's called fuel tax or in tax. You're paying it through EPD and all of the other taxes that airlines pay governments and so on and so forth. But given we know that other industries are getting better faster than we are, certainly in the West at the moment, well, that's not strictly true everywhere, and given we know that because of the growth in aviation, it's becoming an ever larger percentage of the total output, we do need to do things differently. And we're confident we can do that. The carbon output per passenger has been consistently falling for the last 15 years, largely through engine technology. We're on the cusp of doing electrical flights and short haul, by that I mean up to a couple hundred miles. We're on the cusp of creating meaningful quantities of renewable fuel, so not relying upon fossil fuel for aviation fuel. And I think in the short term, we have enough value in the system, and I use that advisedly because it's not just us, it's those that rely upon us, and I include things like hotels in Scotland, for us to say, well, if we can't overnight change the technology of flying, but we value customers coming from China and India, how else do we reflect that carbon impact? And for me, that's around rewilding Scotland and reinstating peatbogs and investing in wave technology and all the other things that actually, if we get them right, we can not only make a bigger contribution to carbon reduction, but actually create a new industry and potentially make it an even more attractive destination as well.
Yeah, I think Gordon just explained it absolutely perfectly. From an airline perspective, it's actually quite a complicated question you've asked, because when it comes to taxes, yes, it's not always the fuel, but when it comes to fuel taxes and government taxes, they constantly vary. So I do know as an airline, we've actually taken the hit on a number of taxes just so the price of a ticket doesn't change. Otherwise, we're outpriced from the market, or a passenger doesn't want to, there's no demand for that price. So you mentioned with regards to Bombay, key markets for us, definitely the likes of India. We try our best for the price of a ticket not to vary too much, because we're aware of what the demand price is. So it's not all just down to the cost of the fuel. As I said, the government, if you actually have a look at the price of the ticket, for example, if you go on our website and you show the price of the ticket, actually shows you the different government taxes, flying from which country over which. So again, routes as well, if you go over a certain country, then you're applied a tax automatically. And we have taken that hit in a number of areas, especially with some diversions and changes in routes like that in the past few years. So it's actually very complicated back office wise, but we try our best to stay competitive and make it a reasonable price. There's actually arguments you're paying for the cheapest price of tickets now and in the past few years than you ever have before. And we definitely try as an airline to try and keep that down as much as possible.
Jenna, thank you. I know you've got another question. Perhaps if you could just ask that question of Gordon, because I've got another question from Vesco, which I think will follow on from your question.
But maybe Gordon wants to highlight a little bit more about what Edinburgh Airport are put in place for safety and hygiene purposes. Yeah,
so we created a sort of campaign which kind of tries to set out the approach called Fly Safe, and it's going to be pretty familiar to everyone, whether you're in a supermarket these days or going anywhere else, but it's about one-way flows, it's about ensuring social distancing, it's about the provision of face masks when it's now mandatory actually to wear them in the airport. It's about frequent hand washing and sanitisation. Completely changed all of the security process to minimise, but can't completely get rid of contact. But we think that's pretty much best of breed, and we're constantly monitoring what other airports are doing. Of course, all of the sort of basic stuff of heightened cleaning, fogging of constantly touched areas and so on. So we're reasonably comfortable with everything we see out there that others are doing. We've got our version of it, and it seems to be working quite well. So we'll keep doing that. The problem is when we look at this, if you do a 2 meters social spacing in the airport, we could get up to about 30% of our normal capacity. If we do a 1 metre spacing, which we're allowed to do where 2 metres isn't possible, we still only get up to about 60 to 70% of our normal capacity. And the idea that we would have to build an extra 30% for the passengers we had last year, probably at a cost of something of the order of £500 million, it's not really credible. So this is why we believe something like testing is a better solution, where the issue is you want the confidence to know that if you are standing or sitting or moving through a process with somebody beside you, that they're clean. Or at least if you can't guarantee they don't have it, they're very unlikely to be contagious because it'll be very early in the process and it's not been detectable. So I think that's the way forward in the short term. But in the short term, all of the things we do are, what you'll see in other walks of life, and I think we're doing them to the best of our abilities.
Well, thank you. We've got a question from Vesco now, more on security, but it links perhaps to what you've been talking about. Or perhaps if I ask Vesco's question, his question relates to the use of technology to make the airport COVID-19 secure and in general to improve physical security. And the question was, has there been any thoughts to implement artificial intelligence to enable CCTV monitoring at scale, for example, to get alerts when people are not wearing face masks in a COVID-19 world, or engaging in other engaging in other high-risk behaviour, such as abandoning bags or exhibiting aggression, that sort of thing?
Yeah, there's not been an awful lot around artificial intelligence yet. I mean, over the years, we've been very active in using CCTV monitoring and increasingly the sort of software analysis of CCTV to look at more security issues. So left bags is a good example, checking if people are sort of doing the right things going through the security process, or even just queue management, making sure we've got enough resource to make sure people don't have to wait too long. I think it's probably still a bit early days to get into technology for COVID. So we tried doing some temperature testing, for example. You run into a pretty big problem of, so what if someone's got a temperature? We're not in a position we can deny travel. So we can advise someone they've got a temperature and they might want to reconsider their travel plans, but I can't ban them from travel. Now, airlines can, but they would then have to mandate me to act on their behalf, and would get into some quite interesting areas, because not only is there an issue about human rights in there and contractual obligations and so on, but temperature as an indicator of COVID is a pretty poor correlation. You can have a temperature for many reasons, not least because you've just had a nice glass of whiskey in the bar before you turned up at security. So there's a whole host of issues around these pretty indeterminate tests, although I think what we see from consumers is they want the reassurance. So they're quite reassured to know they've not got a temperature when they're about to travel. So I'd be happy to offer that service on that basis, but not as a pass-go type system, because it just isn't very effective where there are emerging COVID-specific tests that could be. On your very specific one about scanning people to wear face masks, again, the problem is, so what? I mean, you can walk up to anybody in Scotland today and say, can you please put your face mask on? And they just say, no, I'm exempt, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that includes the police. So effectively, it doesn't really get you very far. I always think these laws they're enacted as laws in a pretty inefficient way. I think it's to give them weight, but but it's not really enforceable in that sense. So what we're really relying upon is simple rules that people understand are in their and the wider community benefits, and they choose to follow them. So hence why we're much more in an advisory role. So my challenge, if I see somebody walking through the airport, as I did the other day, actually with his mask around his neck, and I asked him, is it possible he could wear his mask? And he said, I don't need to. And I say, well, that's true, sir, but it would be really good if you could. And that's as far as you can really go with it. And if they don't have a mask, we sell them at less than cost. So we're trying to give everybody the positive signals to do it rather than the negative signals, which can also lead off to other problems. Being challenging to people can quite often get an adverse reaction.
Gordon, thank you. I hope that's answered your question, Vesco. Roddy, I know you wanted to ask a question of Gordon as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Doug. Gordon, Peter DeVinks, I think, dropped off the call, but I saw he'd posted a question asking whether better or more use could be made at this time of the sort of the real estate assets that you have. In other words, you've got plenty of space, and whether, for example, some of that could be let out on a short lease basis for example, an open air cinema where people could watch from their cars or whatever they would do. Some of that's been going on in the United States. But ideas like that for in the short term to make if you like, the asset sweat. I see Peter is back there. Peter, is that the correct question?
Yes, indeed. I can't see myself, but there we are. Gordon, thank you very much. It was very interesting that at the beginning of March, I was talking to your chairman, and he was telling me that you were expecting that year 15 million passengers through Edinburgh Airport, and today probably you might not even do 3 million. I mean, a shocking experience, and you need to somehow think out of the box, and you have an enormous footprint at Edinburgh Airport. It's a wonderful site, and I could imagine people can't go to the theatre and to the cinema in town, but they could go into your car park and you could put up an enormous screen and have quite new technology that in each car they have wonderful noise of a fantastic, exciting film. I've known that done in the Netherlands in an old airport that is no longer used. And is that something that you might be willing to embrace?
Thanks, Peter. Nice to hear from you. Now you've got my worry, Peter, because we've clearly got a very similar mindset. We've actually been doing films already. In fact, we were the 2020 version of the Edinburgh Film Festival was a drive-in cinema on our second runway. Our old second runway is closed now. And in fact, Peter, you can come as my guest at the end of September. We're going to repeat it all again for the last weekend of September, and there's 4 days of movies, about 3 or 4 movies a day. So have a look online, pick your film, and you can be my guest at that. And it's great fun. Took my daughter to one of them. It was really good fun. On a more serious business, we also have given a big plot of land to the National Health Service testing, COVID testing site. So that was one of our early offers. It was obvious that we were pretty well located and lots of space, as you say, Peter, to allow that to happen. And in fact, we're just in the middle of extending that offer to March next year, and actually encouraging them to expand and try and get more capacity and do that as well. And then, we're constantly looking, this is, as serious as it is a temporary impact, and we will come out the other side of it. So we're still actively promoting our second runway site for a very significant mixed-use development down the bottom end at South End, beside the Gale and the Gogo roundabout. And we're actively promoting a further cargo development up near the remaining operational part of the airport, where we know there's lots of demand for that logistics and that high quality, high value sort of logistics work, mixing the aviation connections with the road and rail connections into the rest of Scotland. So, nothing stops. It's clearly not our top focus at the moment, simply because there's more pressing things to deal with. But the intention is that, 3 years from now, we'll be looking back in this. I'm not sure we'll be back at 15 million passengers, but 3 years we'll be back in the black and again able to turn our head to the much more positive agenda in front of us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very helpful.
Gordon, thank you. We have a question from Benjamin. Benjamin, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. So some months ago, I was on a call and I suggested that Scotland could differentiate itself from the rest of the UK by showing it was a safer destination for air arrivals. And I was told, oh, that's far too political and impossible. And I know that the UK government controls the border, but it does seem that many countries and airports around Europe and around the world are testing and tracing arrivals. And I've got friends and colleagues who are traveling all over the world, and they feel far safer going somewhere where they are tested on arrival, whether arriving domestically or internationally at an airport, and then getting follow-up from the airport to be told either they're fine or they're not. Are there any discussions going on at the moment for Scottish airports to introduce testing on arrival to demonstrate that Scotland is a safer destination for tourists, whether domestic or international?
That's a really good question, Benjamin. I think you've hit the nail on the head. The answer has been we've been banging the drum about this approach for 3 months now, and we are now for the first time starting to get a little bit of traction. And I think a number of things have changed. Firstly, as we slide back into what looks like being a pretty significant second wave, I think there is a dawning realisation that more quarantine and lockdown isn't really the right answer for a whole host of wider reasons. They are effective in terms of managing spread, but they're pretty demonstrably atrocious for everything else in terms of human rights, economy and everything else. So finally we're seeing some response. And in a couple of meetings I've had with the sort of senior clinical advisors, the things that have been getting in the way, I think, are two or threefold. One is they're being asked by politicians what is the safest, and there's no doubt that banning travel is safer than a testing regime. The question is a testing regime safe enough given the other benefits of it to let it back? And we're asking them to engage in at least doing the assessment of that, even if they don't end up recommending it. But I want politicians to have an informed choice, which they haven't had to date. You hear Boris Johnson quoting the fact that arrivals testing is only 7% accurate. That is the worst mangling of statistical nonsense I've heard in a long time. What he was referring to is that for people that have already been tested 12 hours before, you will only pick up a further 7% of the people that were missed in that test. That's not the test we're talking about. That's meaningless as a statistic. And it's very, very annoying that people are using that sort of ill-informed lying to discredit a potential approach. So I think, we've really got to engage on the facts of the matter, because the most important thing here, given the way that government is running, is to give the Scottish Government, and by that I mean Nicola Sturgeon, who's taken a very personal touch to this, informed choice. Because otherwise, how can she come to the right answer? And she may still decide that even though I believe a testing regime is safe enough, she may decide otherwise, and that's what she's voted to do. But at the moment, she doesn't have that choice. I did some maths. I mean, again, excuse my, I'm not a clinician, but I was using other clinical outputs, government statistics, to do the modelling on what did the throwing Greece into quarantine achieve in terms of reducing the number of infections in Scotland. And just using the month of September, which obviously we're in as a result of the quarantine period, my guesstimate, and it's a pretty good one, I'm only out by a very small percentage because I'm using the statistics from government, is that we saved less than one infection in Scotland. Yet we turned off Greece. We turned off 19,000 passengers in the month, half of which were inbound, half of which are keeping tourism jobs in Scotland alive and keeping businesses alive to be here next year. That to me is not a particularly sensible investment, particularly as the death rate is falling very substantially at the moment as well. And as I said at the start, my very conservative assumption about how much money we're spending on saving a life from COVID is about £150 million per life at the moment. And all I've done is taken what we spend on the very obvious expenditure on furlough and on some of the bank loan stuff and some of the other business support mechanisms, and divided it by the 250,000 jobs 350,000 lives we so far might have saved, based on the fact that lockdown was justified and the fact that we might kill 400,000, and we've killed 150,000 to date. Now, if we keep on spending £150 million per life, we will bankrupt ourselves very, very quickly, and we'll have nothing to pay for it in any event, because all of these spends are about stopping businesses doing what they do, stopping jobs being created or saved, and stopping tax income for the future that's going to be paying for the health service. So I don't think we're making rational decisions at the moment, because it's so difficult for a politician to even suggest that they might trade one life for 10,000 jobs. That just seems to be an unpalatable discussion to have. Yet we do it all the time, through decisions about which drugs we use, through decisions on where we spend our money, on the way we design roads and railways, for example. We put numbers on lives all the time then, but it seems impossible to do in this COVID crisis.
Gordon, thank you. We're fast approaching the end, but I've got another question from Jenna. If you'd like to ask your question, if you would, please.
Well, just to end on that note, on your great insight again, is what can we do as an airline or individuals actually on this call to support Edinburgh Airport going forward?
I mean, I'd say when you can, then fly. That's the obvious thing, and your own appetite for that will be a very personal choice about the needs for travel, about how safe people feel, about whether you want to. There's lots of debate about will people go back to business travel, or will everything be done over Zoom again. I think some of the challenges we've had here suggest that there's something to be said for face-to-face meetings. I'll certainly be one of the first people on an airplane to go and meet Akbar over in Qatar when I get the moment, or when they allow me to do so. So we've got to understand that this is more than just convenience or anything else. Aviation supports so many things, and it's not just the economy. I mean, the value of, how do you put a value in visiting a relation you don't otherwise get to see? How do you put a value on understanding another country's culture that might stop you getting into a trade war or potentially worse? You know, I think the human condition benefits from understanding each other, and I think travel is an essential part of that understanding, as well as just wanting to go off and lie in the sun every now and then because we live in Scotland. So all of these things, I think, add value, and I'll leave you with a thought that says, although I'm utterly certain that aviation demand will be significantly depressed for a period of time, when I stop hearing people say that before they die, their top 5 things don't have at least 4 that enjoy travel, then I won't worry too much. You know, we will hopefully get back to that aspirational enjoyment of travel for its sake, once we've fixed the sustainability agenda and the carbon outputs and all the other things that worry people, and of course get past the COVID risk. But fundamentally, travel is a force for good, and I think we should remember that when we're putting the brakes on and thinking about the future.
Gordon, thank you very much indeed. I don't know if we've got any other further questions.
Gordon, the most vital thing is that your shareholder, who was so brilliant selling Gatwick Airport just a few months before the lockdown, and he got a fantastic sum of money for it, that he will stick with you. How confident are you that you will have their support?
I'm 100% confident that they have still continued to be incredibly close, hands-on, and very engaged in thinking about our future and helping us get there. So I've got absolutely no doubt about that. And Peter, you're probably aware of this. They didn't sell all of Gatwick. They sold 51% because they like aviation, they like the assets. They're very good at adding value to these assets. And I've got no doubt that they won't be leaving us behind until they can guarantee a similar good value. And that won't be the next year or two, will it?
I don't know if that was a question back to Peter, Gordon, but Gordon, thank you. I think we've really sort of time's caught us up. And it's really falls upon me to thank you, and thank you so much for a very informative and frank account of the significant challenges that are facing both Edinburgh Airport and the aviation sector at the moment. It's heartening to hear that Edinburgh Airport, based on the things that you've put in place, is good for the foreseeable future. And I'm sure, as you suggested, that the aviation sector will continue to benefit in the future, because people will, of course, want to travel and achieve these bucket list items. But clearly, there's some need for some really difficult decisions on policy, and the point you make about where we spend our money, and we need to balance risk, and that's something which I think it relies upon us or government to make these decisions. Because clearly it's out of kilter at the moment. But Gordon, we're really grateful to you for joining us this afternoon and sharing these topical conversations at the moment. So thank you very much indeed for your contribution, and thank you very much for being a member of our International Advisory Council, for which we're also extremely grateful. And hopefully we'll be able to see you in person at an event in the very near future. And I know Roddy would want to extend his thanks to you too as well. And of course, we wish to thank Jenna for your contribution from Qatar Airways, and for making it a very interesting discussion this afternoon. So to both of you, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, and I hope I didn't depress you all too much.
Not at all.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good. And all those who were listening, and for your questions. Have a great day, as they say in the United States of America.